Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further in hopes that it is helpful for you in your life and your faith. I am sitting here with Jordan Geist, our associate pastor, following up on part 4 of You've Got a Friend in Me. My name's Jeremy, and as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube or you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. Jordan, today is a big day. Are you aware of this?
I think I know what you speak.
It's your birthday.
This is true.
It's your We're recording this on a Tuesday.
Yep.
Tuesday, and it is your birthday today.
Yes.
How's it going so far?
It's been nice so far. People have been nice.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And
Aging.
you're how old now?
I wonder how old people think I am that don't know how old I am. I feel like people either guess way too low or way too high. No, we're accurate. 28. I'm 28.
28.
Not that much suspense.
Do you feel 28? I mean, there's not a lot exciting about that one, but are you excited to be 28?
I guess so. I had a quarter life crisis at 27 because that was late 20s.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
I think 24, 25, 26, like late 20s was 27. And so that was one of the first birthdays where I was like, oh, I'm supposed to have my life figured out. I'm supposed to be an adult. I'm not a college student anymore. Mm-hmm. So 28 feels more like 27.
Yeah.
Kind of the same. It's like, all right.
Or it's your 7th 21st. Is that the other way of looking at it?
Right.
Yep.
Yep. Anniversaries of your 21st birthday or something like that.
Yeah. Cool.
So, 3-0 is coming quick.
Yes, it is. That'll be a big one.
Yeah. I don't know how many you look forward to after this, but
I guess
they're behind us.
Yeah. Well, what do you have planned today? Are you doing anything special?
I think we're going to dinner somewhere. I don't know exactly where.
Pretty
Probably
crazy.
A fun spot. So, you got to live it up. Those 28th birthdays.
Yep.
So, typical Tuesday, and then something fun tonight. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Well, following up on your message this past Sunday.
Yes.
You shared a story about this whole series has been full of car stories, really. It's because we've been traumatized by these storms, right? And you talked about the Honda Civic that you were super stoked about getting a little less than a year ago, getting just almost destroyed, but still very functional by hail. And none of your windows broke, right? Which is good.
Correct. Yeah, just the side view mirror came off. Taillight's cracked. And but no,
and then about
no
a million
glass,
dents.
no broken glass.
Yep. So let me ask you this, because as the storms have rolled in, so my car did not get damaged during that storm because I wasn't at North Point when that happened.
Oh, yeah.
I had gone home to work from home the rest of the day, and I'm grateful I did. But every storm since then has given me this anxiety as I've seen everybody.
Pull it outside.
Get to go to Vegas, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Bring it on, God. Bring on the hail.
Stand out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you. Have these storms have come? Are you just pretty much at this point, whatever happens?
Nervous the next time it got dark, I got a little bit of anxiety, and then I kind of thought through that process of it's already fairly jacked. So I mean, at this point, I get more nervous about Emily's car outside than mine now because I'm I don't even know how you'd know what the new dents were and what the whole one were. It is what it is.
Yeah, get another insurance check. For the Honda Civic that's already dented.
Yes, but it's been nonstop storms. It's been a weird when you're living in Austin, you're supposed to be one of the sunniest cities in the U.S. and it's been a lot of it in this May and June now. I don't know what it is.
Well, they said it's the wettest May, and then the first week of June is the wettest first week of June in years too. So it's just
it very much feels that way. That feels accurate.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, we're not going to talk about the weather on this podcast. We're going to dive in and have a little bit of a better conversation for our listeners.
Okay.
So you talked about the whole idea that if you want to connect at a heart level, you have to communicate at a heart level. Mm-hmm. And what we've been saying in this whole series is the quality of life is only as good as the quality of our relationships. And so for us to have quality relationships, we have to know what it means to connect in a quality way at a heart level. And so this communication thing, like you said, is really important. But so often we end up arguing about, getting in conflict about, talking about the wrong things. We're arguing about some sort of object or subject, or we were late, or we wanted to go to a dinner at a different place, or there's a friendship, didn't text me back. But there's more of a heart thing going on that's kind of a deeper layer for each person. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But at the end of your message, you gave 3 big kind of action item points. And I wrote them down. They are identify what is happening in your heart, listen for what is happening in their heart, and then invite God into the process. Mm-hmm. And these three kind of action items are ways in which we can communicate at a heart level. I want to take these three and unpack them a little bit individually, because I know every week, I think I'm the time guy in our meetings in terms of trimming down messages to fit it in a Sunday morning.
Always telling me what people don't want to hear.
I know, pretty much. I'm like, cut that. You worked really hard, but just cut it. I want to dive into these three things a little more, because these are big things that can make a big difference in our relationships. So let's talk about the first one. Identify what is happening in your heart. This goes back to some of the self-awareness stuff we talked about in part 2, which if you're listening and you haven't listened to part 2, go back and listen, because that'll bring to light a lot of what we're talking about in this identify what is happening in your heart with some of that self-awareness stuff. But unpack this a little bit more. What does this look like to identify what is happening in our heart?
Yeah, well, I've always said, I feel like self-awareness is almost a little bit of a superpower. I mean, if you could really know what it's like on the other side of you, like what people think about you, what they say about you, how they're reacting to you. I mean, I think it's incredible. And I was just, talking with my own counselor about this in the past week, about to be vulnerable with somebody like actually requires a degree of self-awareness, right? There's some types of vulnerability where, you're like willingly like withholding something. You're like, there's a new group of people. I don't know if I trust this crowd. I don't know if I want to share that. I don't know how they react. But then there's other times where you don't even know why you're reacting the way you're reacting. Like you're mad maybe, or you're scared, but you can't even actually name like where that's coming from, why you're responding so strong to something that maybe is disproportionate to what actually happened. And so to even like be vulnerable and connect with somebody requires a degree of self-awareness to know what's happening in here. And that journey for me, I mean, the whole world of communication is just something that I'm very passionate about, I think, for lots of reasons. I mean, some of it's just lived experience. I just remember being very confused, like why I would fight with the important people in my life about the same things over and over and over again, and there are certain people that like bring certain sides of me out, like with my mom. And I've told her this, I feel like she can bring out middle school Jordan faster than anybody. And I'll get like in a fight with her, and I'll get defensive, and I'll get petty. And I'm like, I don't treat anybody else this way. Like, why do I revert back to that self around her? Or my dad, I'll feel small around my dad a lot, or like really dumb, really incompetent, or Emily, when I'm like arguing and getting defensive with her, I'm like, I know I should not get defensive about these dumb things, but I can't help it. And so some of that is the curiosity. Some of that is, like what you and I get to do for a living. I mean, communicating from stage is one element of that, but, small groups or one-on-one settings, it's fascinating to sit down with somebody and like watch them listen. And sometimes there's like an inability to hear something, and it's not even that they're not like willing or trying. It's like they can't, because there's a degree of self-awareness that they like have to dive into first. And so I don't even know if all that makes sense or not, but it's like a required first step, throughout this process. And so there's some practical ways I think we could talk about. One of the things that was cut that I was excited about talking about was this idea of a timeout, which sounds almost like too practical or too silly, but in that marriage retreat that I referenced in the message, one of the things that was very empowering was this concept of taking a time out, specifically like when you're in conflict with somebody, specifically like for the purpose of self-awareness, to actually think about what's happening inside here. And the reason that was helpful for me is because I think if Emily and I get to a point, where we're arguing and we need to take time out, I feel like we failed. I'm like, come on, we're adults. We can talk about this. That feels like petty or something. But it's the idea of like your brain is in self-preservation mode, like your raw emotion is coming out, like what Jesus says in Luke 6, like your heart is coming out. So you have to take some time away to identify like what is happening in here. Not take some time apart to build up your argument so you can just come back and argue better, but to like identify, okay, why am I getting defensive, or why am I yelling, or why won't I talk? Why am I numb right now? Why am I avoiding? However your kind of reaction is. Taking that time to discover what that is, and then step 2, which we'll get to discover, what's happening in their heart. So sometimes it's practical like that.
I would add to that really quick, the timeout thing. One of the things that we've mentioned before from Sunday, we've talked about is not just like a timeout, but the whole halt BS. There's like 6 things you should look out for, because you're probably not mentally, emotionally, even spiritually at your best when these 6 things are happening. And it's hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, or stressed.
Right.
And most likely, if you're in a conflict with somebody and you're experiencing those things, which hungry can be solved in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Get a meal,
Yeah.
eat it, and then, oh my goodness, you feel so much better.
Right.
But in the same way, like maybe sometimes it's helpful to take a time out with, even when you're like, I think I got some marital advice a long time ago, like don't fight after 10 p.m.
Yeah.
Like just go to bed and then wake up the next morning and like try to get a little bit of space. On one hand, like you don't want to stew on it, but at the same time, like you're just tired. Like nothing good is going to come from that, like that time out. But also if you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, stressed, like figure that out first so you're in your best headspace to work through the conflict.
Yep. Yeah, what basically you're trying to do is you're trying to regulate. I mean, that's what you're trying to get to, right? You're trying to get everything back online. Like breathing is oftentimes really helpful, in this space, but you're trying to get that part of your brain back online that can think rationally. And that list you just talked about, halt BS, all of that kind of gets it off. Any kind of emotion that's tripped gets that off. And it's just helpful to know, like your brain's just trying to protect itself. And if it's trying to protect you, you're not stepping into the world of the person on the other side of you. It's just not a helpful moment to try to connect.
Yep.
So that kind of like knowing that that's a tool, because anybody important in your life, if you've clashed with them enough times, you start to like notice the patterns, and it's almost like the earlier on in the process, you can tell like, okay, we're both kind of like positioning, we're both kind of defending, we're both kind of minimizing. Like, you can tell this is going somewhere. Like the earlier you can like stop that process, because it's heading nowhere good. You're about to say some things you regret. Now you're gonna have to apologize for those as well. But to try to like pause and be like, what's happening in here, the better that's going to be.
Yeah. And again, I think we're getting into some of those, like the mechanics, the tools. Sure. But again, like if our quality of our life is only as good as the quality of relationships, these are really, really helpful tools to apply. And there's a spiritual component to all of these things. Like our relationship with God is so interwoven, and we're going to get to that next. What else would you add to, identify what is happening in your heart? Is there anything else?
Well, yeah, it's like there's both this kind of in the moment spot where it's helpful and practical to kind of like step into and try to identify what's happening. But then there's like this doing your own work over time process that allows you in those moments of conflict to actually identify what's in your heart, right? So there's kind of like there's both and. There are some, like you just like some very practical tools in a moment of conflict to try to identify. But this is kind of like, and we talked about this in the message too, not being able to give what you don't have. If you haven't like explored what's in your heart intentionally, maybe in solitude, maybe in journaling, maybe on the other side of a friend or counselor, you're not going to be able to necessarily identify much either when you're taking that time out and breathing or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So this is where, this would kind of be to repeat part 2 a little bit, which I don't want to get into a ton, but this is where those tools and that kind of long-term practice of discovering you is helpful. And some of that, like we said, that's counseling. Enneagram, that was one of the things you kind of had me cut, which I understand. I could talk about that for a while, but those are some of the examples of that. We could go through those potentially.
Yeah, I'd love to go through those, because I think that, you shared your core question,
right,
and Emily's core question when you guys are in times of conflict. But the reality is, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a parent, friend, spouse, whatever it might be, in any relational conflict, we all have that question that's kind of the heart level. And the Enneagram helps kind of uncover some of those really well. And I think you pulled y'all's questions directly from the Enneagram. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty close to that. Pretty close. Yeah.
So
see mine on 3 and
Let's talk through some of those questions, because some people listening might be able to relate with like a certain core question.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, it's, basically a personality profile that's based on these 9 normals. You're actually not really supposed to even name the 1 through 9. They're given a number for that exact reason. They're not supposed to have a label, although we do label them. But there's these kind of 9 normals, and the reason I like them so much is because they do hone in on, they're identified by their kind of core fears and core desires. And what is so great about that is it's not even necessarily a personality per se in terms of extroverted or introverted or all of that, but it just kind of gets to like your heart's desire, and a lot of that is formed in our childhood. There was kind of a way in the world we learned to cope with the world in terms of like, okay, when I perform, I'm accepted, that kind of thing. We get a lot of these messages young. So there are 9 normals. If you are a 1, that is being bad or wrong. That's like your core fear is like somebody reflects something or says something. Maybe it's, feedback. Maybe that's hard for you to receive because you feel like there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Like I am broken, I am flawed, I am messed up. That's your core fear. The 2 is being unloved or unwanted, or even very specifically like their help not being wanted. It's not just that they like couldn't help somebody else, but somebody wouldn't want their help. And it's like, okay, if you don't want my like free love, my free help, I feel completely abandoned. I feel alone. A 3, which is what I am, that's that being worthless or a failure. I said kind of the core of am I enough? But the 3 is this very like performance based, success and failure. And so the big fear is if I'm not performing, if I'm not successful, like people are going to abandon me, people are going to leave me. A 4 is being without significance or having identity. And so 4, oftentimes they're very creative types. They kind of have this fear of like blending into the crowd and not being seen. And so they're typically, kind of beat to their own drum a little bit, usually very creative types or have a creative flair. A 5 is being incompetent or incapable, which I think you have a 5 wing. I've accused you of being 5 before, but we've landed on you being a 6. But a 5 is being incompetent or incapable. They're usually very prepared, very well read, perhaps. They're usually very smart as a result. But if they're like being wrong or like I wasn't prepared, I didn't know what to do in a scenario, that can make them feel very overwhelmed and very trapped. A 6 being without support or guidance. So that's what you are, right?
Yep.
Emily is as well, which I've seen some, describe as being afraid of fear itself, but there's almost like this imagination of all the kind of worst case scenarios of what could go wrong. 6 is called a loyalist. And that kind of security is that stability is something that like 6s will strive for and go after. And I think your 5 wing results in you being like very prepared in order to have a stable surrounding environment around you, right?
Yep.
The 7 being deprived, trapped, or limited. Pretty much it's a fear of missing out. That's like kind of a 7 score. They didn't get an invite to the party. Like that's their core. Like I'm not wanted. I'm not a part of this crew. I'm not a part of this group. Usually have a lot of friends. It's pretty typical of a 7, commonly extroverted. An 8 is being harmed or controlled, or their people being harmed. So very much like, man, if you tell me what to do, if you kind of constrict me, that is scary to an 8 because like they like to be able to protect themselves and their most people in their environment. And a 9 is afraid of being separated or a loss of others. They can maybe a little bit of a people-pleasing category, but almost more like just an avoidance of conflict. Like I want to smooth things over. I want everybody to be okay. I don't want to be like disconnected with people around me because of drama or anything like that. So very even keel and calm often a lot of times are 9s. So that's where, those are going to be very different, and what might offend or upset or, spin somebody in a conflict cycle might not for somebody else. And this is why you can't necessarily go to this level with every human being in your life. But when we're talking about the important relationships, which is what we've done in this series, it is possible to get to know those people in your life that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just give an example too. I think sometimes it's like, okay, that's a long list of like all sorts of core fears, core motivators, all that stuff. But I think what makes the Enneagram so helpful for me personally is when it just gives verbiage and it just gives words to like what we're feeling and what we're experiencing and who we are at our core. And it's really helpful because it's helpful for you and it's helpful for the person that's on the other side of you. Recently, I'll give an example since you gave a few, but we moved into a house and they put down fresh sod, but then just that there wasn't enough soil underneath it, and then the winter storm came. Our entire yard front and back like died. Like all the Bermuda grass just done. Yeah. And this makes us feel pretty old that we're like talking about grass right now. But I was so upset about it. And I can remember I kept asking Ashley, do you think our yard's okay? Do you think it's okay? And she's like, it's fine. Like, it'll be fine. And it wasn't fine. And I hold that above her now. But I remember like finally one day I had to explain to her, hey, I just want you to know, like, I need to get our grass figured out because like when our grass, like growing up for me, there were projects that were always undone, unfinished. And it just created this sense of like, I don't know, a lack of control in the environment. And I just things weren't organized enough. And so for me, I wanted the sod to grow and be good and be stable and be controlled. And it made me feel like our life, our house, our atmosphere was like better when the grass was good. So I got all the grass replaced because we had to, and the HOA was going to eventually start fining me for it too. So, but that's an example, like for me as a 6, like that control, that support in my environment is really important. And it helped Ashley go, oh, I see why he's going so crazy about this, and she
Right.
gave me a little bit more of grace, empathy when she was able to kind of see that too.
Yeah.
And so that was really helpful. It's just one of my examples how the Enneagram kind of comes to life a little bit.
Yep. 100%. But that's a perfect example because, to somebody else's eyes who doesn't understand, isn't empathetic, trying not to understand, like, dude, it's just grass or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's typically where most of our conflict kind of cycles start. Like the majority of our arguments are, it's something in that category. I shared a dishes story, I send it, but it doesn't always have to be. I mean, certainly it can be, but it doesn't have to be a traumatic, life-changing event. Oftentimes, a lot of these miscommunications happen in the everyday, kind of interactions with one another because our hearts are speaking every day. And if,
100%.
somebody's not attuned to those, this is where we can get off the rails. So
Yeah. I think for anybody listening who has maybe not diving into the Enneagram, I want to share a few helpful resources. One is you can Google Enneagram test.
Yeah.
And Google should be able to autocorrect if you don't know how to spell Enneagram, but it starts with an E, so just take it from there, spell it out, and then if you Google it, you can find some tests, and then the real test is like $12, and it's with the Enneagram Institute, and when you take this one, it asks you a ton of questions, and then it gives you this just like layout of your number and what it means and how it relates to other numbers, and in stress, it's this and that kind of stuff. There's also a really good book that a few of us have read or listened to here. I'm listening to it right now. It's called The Road Back to You by, do you know who it's by? Ian Cromwell. Does that ring a bell?
I mean, I do know, but I'm just going to test you and see.
Are you going to look it up right now?
Sure.
It's called The Road Back to You. And it is, I'm listening to it right now. It's been great. And it unpacks each number like really specifically and how they relate to other things. And so that's a good way to get kind of a head start with this thing. Did you find it?
Yeah, Ian Morgan.
Ian Morgan.
Cron, C-R-O-N. And then it stops.
Okay, so I was close. I got the first name right.
Yeah.
So Ian Morgan Cron.
Yeah.
So The Road Back to You. I'm listening to it. It's a great listen. So if you have not dove into the Enneagram, that's a great place to do so.
And Suzanne Stabile.
Okay.
Two people.
Suban. Okay.
Yeah, we nailed that together.
Yeah.
Well done, sir.
Yeah. Road Back to You. Just get the name. Google fills in all the gaps.
Strong endorsement.
Yeah. Yeah, man. All the payment that we were getting for that endorsement.
They better give us some proceeds from that
right.
one. Goodness.
That was good. I will add this on there too. I've always been a fan of this proverb, but I think this is such an important process. It's a spiritual process too. But Solomon wrote years ago, he said, "A man's heart are like deep waters. One with insight draws them out." So a wise person looks into their heart like deep waters. You can't see what's at the depths, but you do the work and you do the prayerful process of discovering what's in your heart so that you can have a better relationship with God. You can know yourself better. You can have better relationships with other people. So that's the first one. Identify what is happening in your heart. The second one is listen for what is happening in their heart. These are those action items you gave on Sunday. You gave an example of this, but can you unpack this one a little bit more, what it means to listen for what is happening in their heart?
Yeah, so I think, this is another one that has in the moment of conflict implications and like times of peace implications, and in the times of peace, it looks like some habits and rhythms to, intentionally get to know and discover the heart of whoever it is that we're talking about. It's intentional time with your children, taking them to breakfast or their, favorite restaurant or whatever. It's a weekly meeting, perhaps, with your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it might be, where you're asking intentional questions to discover them. I think, a lot of relationships have almost this arc a little bit where like, there's this exciting period if it's a friendship, I really like this person and we laugh and we start to make some memories, or certainly there's a honeymoon period if it's a romantic relationship. And then we kind of assume we know a person without realizing like, man, for the rest of my life, if I'm intentional, if this is an important relationship to me, I have the ability to discover more of their heart than I did yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so there's this lifelong process, and you can't, this is what I mentioned earlier, you can't do this with everybody in your life, but we're talking about some of the core relationships in your life, probably your, immediate family and maybe some very close friends, like that type of thing. And the intentionality with those people, I just refer to it as times of peace, to get to discover their heart, allows you then to in the moments of conflict or tension, or, you're conversing about something you disagree on, now you're kind of listening for the energy in their voice. Now, some people are very straightforward with their energy, and you don't have to listen hard. You're like, okay, they're screaming, it's happening. But other times, like, you know, you get to know the subtleties of like their tone is changing, or they're repeating themselves, or they have a look, or they stop making eye contact. Like you get that kind of sixth sense with the people you care about that something is off. You know, sometimes when it's, you know, your spouse or your best friend, you can just walk in the room and know things aren't right, you know, and you're looking, okay, the energy is off. So regardless of what they say, you know, doesn't mean they're lying to you, but they might be like in an emotional place themselves, and they're trying to communicate something from their heart, but you're listening for like what is underneath, right? And so I gave that car example to say, like, Emily felt pretty strongly, and I want to clarify when I say she wasn't yelling at me in the car or anything like that, but it was just enough that it wasn't like a casual convo about the car. I could tell like she really wanted us to fix it, and I was kind of confused. I mean, like, we share all our stuff, but I mean, like, we'd kind of have my car, her car. I didn't know why she cares a lot about my car. Like, I'm the one that has to drive the beat up car anyways. Like, I would think she, you know, the extra money, we could go get her next car whenever we get one, or, you know, whatever it is. But like I said, it took me a couple minutes longer than I would like. And part of that goal, that conflict cycle, is you actually, over time, the time you're in the cycle just gets shorter and shorter. So sometimes, again, that can be like weeks at a time or hour-long fight or whatever. Over time, you're trying to like get that down to like really short, like that, okay, the emotion is tripped, and then like there's a moment of vulnerability where we identify where that moment is, you know, what was coming out of the heart. But it's listening for that energy and then asking like really curious, intentional questions. You know what I mean? You're not trying to like win an argument. You're not trying to defend your side. You're not trying to be right. You are genuinely trying to discover, okay, where is this emotion coming? You know, hey, how are you feeling right now? Like, what comes up for you? You know, and asking some of those like exploring questions to figure out like, okay, this is what they're actually afraid of in this moment, or what they're actually desiring in this moment. You know, probably has nothing to do with a car, but trying to listen at that level gets you kind of out of this headspace, because you know how we are when we nitpick on little words, but you said this, no, you said that first, and why did you bring up, and blah, and it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, sure, those words are important, but like, we're trying to listen at the level underneath. And as soon as you can recite that back to somebody, that feeling of being heard, you know, that feeling of being understood is one of the most disarming and incredibly connective experiences of like, they get me. And that doesn't mean you agree with them. Those are two different things, but to be understood in that moment, you know, is one of the most powerful relational dynamics. And that's what you're really fighting for that moment, is to spend your world in their headspace, not your headspace. Yeah. That makes sense.
I think sometimes, it totally makes sense. I think what can be difficult sometimes is when we don't know us well, but we're making an attempt to know them.
Yeah.
Why is that difficult to do? Why is that a problem?
Yeah. I mean,
and this is why you listed that one first.
Right.
Like, know your heart first and then listen for theirs.
Yeah. Yeah. I think knowing what's coming up in you allows you to be a little bit more in that, what we kind of talked about, that prefrontal cortex, that little bit more of that calm, rational headspace where you can think about their world. Because if you're still like all up in your fear and you haven't named it yet, and you haven't realized, okay, this is actually what, you know, I'm afraid of, because that can kind of, again, like regulate. We used that word earlier. As soon as I realized with the dishes example, Emily is not going to leave me as a result of the fact that I didn't do the dishes this week. You know, it helps me calm down a little bit and then be in her world. So part of it is that. Part of it has to do with a security a little bit, to be like, when I kind of understand and am secure in where I'm at, I can consider their part without feeling like I need to prove mine. This is not the moment where I'm like making my case, you know, where I'm fighting with them or anything like that. So the security of, I know me, now I can sit with you, you know, gives you the strength to kind of do that. So that's why I would refer to it in that kind of order. And you can't totally do both simultaneously. You know, I mean, it's a little bit back and forth in a conversation, but, you know, as long as you're thinking about your space, you're in this kind of defensive mode that is hard to connect. So,
yeah. No, that's good. So the third one is to invite God into the process, both individually, like you're inviting into your process of listening to your heart, and you're also inviting him into the process of the relationship of listening for what's happening in their heart. Let's unpack this one a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, one of the big things that, was tough, because it probably was only a couple minutes at the end of the message, but is like so core to all this, is I really don't want to miscommunicate that just because you know what's happening in their heart, or if you identify what's happening in your heart, that now all of a sudden you guys can meet that for each other. Like the goal is not, I know what's happening in Emily's heart, so now I can permanently make her feel safe. Mm-hmm. Like I can't meet all the fears of her heart and desires of her heart. I'm a human being, and nor can I expect that from her, or we're both going to be let down. That's a recipe for disaster. So what this allows you to do is like, okay, I've recognized fair or unfair, not doing the dishes made me feel like I'm not enough. Well, now I go to the one who has already spoken on what my identity is, and that's my Heavenly Father, right? And now I have to go to some of the core things that I trust that my identity is actually rooted in, which has nothing to do with dishes, and say, my identity is rooted in what Christ has already done for me. Like, I am loved by God. I am a son of God. Like, those things are unchanging. I'm made in his image. Like, those things are true of me. Doing or not doing the dishes this week has nothing to do with any of that. It doesn't have any barring on those. And so now I can go and sit, with Emily from a secure place and be vulnerable. This gives me the strength to I can admit that I failed, because that now doesn't affect my identity in any way, shape, or form, right? So one of the big things is to actually go get the desires of your heart met. And that's, I think, part of what Jesus is saying, like, what's in your heart is going to come out. So if you've taken what's in your heart to God, right, now some of the more unhealthy things of our heart don't necessarily have to spill onto those people around us, because God has already met us in that.
Yeah.
So it gives us, one, that ability, has a direct translation to our ability to be vulnerable, because now a lot of times we try to be vulnerable, but then the person on the other side of us doesn't apologize perfectly or own their stuff, or they keep the argument going, and now we're like, oh, that was a waste,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, in order to keep showing up, we have to show up as our whole selves, which I have a hard time finding, a place that you could do that outside of your relationship with God, to say he's the one that allows you to show up as your whole self.
Yep.
And you kind of mentioned this also earlier, but in terms of that, pulling out of those deep waters, who I really am, it is in the presence of God that we can really discover who we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually part of the reason, I think, one of my favorite, Brennan Manning's quotes is, he's like, have you ever wondered or marveled at your internal resistance to prayer? Why is spending time with God so hard for us to prioritize sometimes? We can get busy, we can clean, we can read another book, but to grab that Bible that's sitting on, to actually just pause and pray, sometimes we avoid that like crazy. And that's because we're going to go be our real selves in front of God.
And that's uncomfortable.
Right. And we know that subconsciously there's something in us that knows that I can't hide from him like I've been hiding from everybody else or whatever it is. And so being in his presence on a regular basis is probably number one of all those. Yes, Enneagram's great, and yes, counseling is great, but being in his presence consistently is going to be the greatest factor to help us discover who we are. Mm-hmm. And so, it's all of that wrapped up in there, but he gives us strength and patience and grace to have those conversations. He speaks to what our identity is so that we can actually be vulnerable. He knows our heart, so he helps us discover our heart and perhaps consider the heart of the person on the other side of us as well. So I almost delivered this in such a way to say, hey, steps 1 and 2 are really good. Do steps 1 and 2. And if you're a follower of Christ, then do step 3. But even if you're not, steps 1 and 2 are helpful. But part of what's hard about that is I almost get a little nervous that I'm setting people up for failure to say, I don't really know that steps 1 and 2 do work without step 3. Because I think it's just a matter of time to where the cycle is going to break down unless, you have something from outside of you that's enabling this whole process of connection. So,
yeah. Man, you talked about a lot there. I think I want to hit on a couple things you just mentioned. One of them was just, if you go back to the Enneagram, and again, I would encourage people to go find out what their number is so they can kind of take this and apply it to them. But when you talked about taking the dishes. The dishes did not define you because you were already secure in Christ.
Yep.
More specifically to you, you were already enough. Like if that's your core fear, your core motivator, like you were already enough before the dishes even got dirty. Like, you know, you were already good in God's eyes. And that's what you're saying allowed you to kind of go and be able to be in that argument from a like secure place.
Yep.
And Emily couldn't do anything to fill that hole. Like there's nothing anybody can do to fill the God-sized hole that's in all of our hearts.
Yeah.
Like it has to be God filling that hole, which is a little bit of what you're alluding to. But that whole like concept of it being the enough piece for you, I think for me, it's like, you know, I have to go to Ashley, or I have to go to my parents or somebody else that I'm in a relationship with, I have to go to them with security already, in peace, and the fact that, like, regardless of if my life is out of control, I know that God has it all. I know that, like, I can be okay, I can be at peace, even if everything is just going all over the place and I have no security and no support. My security is found in Christ. And again, it's from there that I can then engage in my relationships, and I'm not expecting anything from people. I'm just trying to have great relationships with people at that point, right? That's a little bit of what you're alluding to, right?
Yep, 100%. Yeah, and I think what's so cool about this, too, is it's like the way that God allows you to show up in those relationships, and the more, like you were just talking about, you show up as your whole self in those, the more likely that conflict cycle is to go well, or really you're to break out of that conflict cycle and connect with one another. But what's also amazing is God still often uses that person on the other side of us to help us, like, in our aloneness, And so I think about what's wild if you use Emily and I's, for example, and then so many are this way. I'm afraid that I'm not enough. She's afraid that she's not safe. This is what I kind of, summarized this weekend. But if I am willing to admit, like, hey, this is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that I'm not enough. Well, when I think about her core fear is that she's not safe. So she's desiring me to show up for her. In other words, like, I'm a safe relationship for her. That makes me feel enough when I'm realizing, like, she just wants me. Like, she wants me to be engaged. That's a very empowering, like, wow, I kind of feel enough right now. And when I am saying, hey, I desire to be enough for you, she's like, that's a pretty safe feeling that you're sitting here and, like, your core desire is, like, you just want to show up for me and be enough for me. So if just one of us are willing to be vulnerable, we take a step in the other's direction. And so many of them, like, perfectly complement each other, that way. You could take any core fear combination and come to that same desire to say, like, man, God can use, both parties in this side, and this, again, this works with whatever the relationship is, to complement each other in this beautiful way. And he's kind of using this person on the other side of you to show up, but he's not ever removed from the process, so he's in all of it. And, that's where it kind of is complex to explain, but
yeah, for sure. So. Well, I also like, on that note, what you said a second ago. You said, what you need to do is on a regular basis, sit in the presence of God. I love that you didn't say you need to go read your Bible more, you need to go do this more. All of those things are great. But I think so often we do just need to, like, the part of that, drawing those things out of the deep waters that's in our heart. We can't just journal one day and be like, I figured it out. You got to sit on the other side of your Heavenly Father over and over and over again and say, God, would you just reveal these things to me?
Yep.
And then as you do it over and over again, you watch him just, like, bring to light so many things you didn't see before.
Yep.
And that's sitting in the presence of him, being on the other side of him. And that's where all those questions are going to be answered the most too. Because when you sit in his presence, in light of everything, for me personally, like, when I have crazy weeks where it feels out of control, all of my stress triggers start to go nuts, and I'm like on edge about it because it feels unsafe. It feels out of control, and I can't control it all. When I sit in his presence, it's like I can just sit still with him for 5 minutes, not say a single thing, and I get the most amount of peace that I'm like, I don't know where else I could get that from except from my Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he meets you in those moments. And then you go into your relationships and you just engage from that place. It's like, it's freeing. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's what I think he designed us to connect as. Like, I think he designed us to connect that way, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In the very same way, if I go sit with him sad about my dishes,
Yeah.
I mean, it just puts in a perspective faster than anything to be like, what am I doing? Like, what am I actually scared of? Like, God has already spoken on like this, who I am, and so, it's that presence with him that is so clarifying.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think, one last thing on that is just I think a lot of people get to a point in their spiritual life, because this is a relationship discussion, but it's a spiritual problem in a lot of ways. I think people get to their spiritual life, and maybe they're giving, or they're serving on Sundays, or they're in a group, or all of these really great things that help us grow in our faith, but perhaps feel like, what's more? Like, I want something more. Like, I love that desire and that craving, because that's where God brings us to a point where we're really just desiring him, and where we're desiring him to reveal himself to us in new ways. And a lot of times it is this heart work. It's diving into the depths of your heart and beginning to understand the way God made you, the way he wired you, watching him show up in those moments. That's kind of part of a spiritual journey that we all go on, and we get to that point. And so if you're listening right now and, this is you, and I want to discover more about how God made me and my heart and all these things, man, go take that Enneagram test, jump in, sit with God, and watch what he reveals to you, because I think it'll be incredible.
Yeah, if you're always just gonna want more if you're not going to him, right?
Yep.
I mean, if it's like all of these noise busy things that keep you around him, but it's not like him,
Yep.
then you're just always going to desire exactly that. And
Yep.
he's on the other side of what you really want. So
yeah, for sure. Well, cool. This has been great. Thank you, Jordan, for diving into these three with us. I think it's been really, really helpful. And I'm kind of sad. It's been really, really a good series the past 4 weeks. We're ending it this week, part 5.
Yep.
And I think it's a good ending because sometimes in relationships we have conflict and we can work through the conflict cycle and we can talk about it. But sometimes things hurt a little bit more than that.
Right.
And it leaves a little bit of a wound,
Yeah.
and you got to figure out, okay, how can I have a relationship, or how can I not let this wound get out on other relationships in my life too? And that's where forgiveness comes in. And we're actually going to be talking about this Sunday for part 5 to wrap up the series. And I think the discussion is going to be really helpful. I hope it is. And I hope to see all of you there, whether you are in person or watching online. We're excited about it, and we'll see you for part 5. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks for having me, man.